But something else I want to show is I actually had a really good exchange, a really interesting. I don't want to call it exchange. I was responding to somebody, a guy who follows me on Twitter, who I really like. He's conservative and pretty smart guy, but we had a disagreement as we usually do. And he says, in response to my response to Chip Roy, he says, my issue with the Section 4 clause is that the executive branch doesn't have the power of the purse regarding the Constitution, so I don't know how they can recommend or justify the president using it. And I responded with a long series, with a long thread, kind of making my case, because of course Twitter doesn't really lend itself well to these in-depth conversations. But I kind of want to share it with you. So I said, look, the Constitution grants Congress the power of the purse, which Congress used to authorize the current debt and require the Treasury to pay it. The debt ceiling is a product of federal statute, which is subordinate to constitutional law. The debt ceiling is not a product of the Constitution. It's nowhere in the Constitution. It's a secondary level of federal law, which is beneath the Constitution, inferior to the Constitution. So if Congress tries to compel the president to violate federal statute or the Constitution, Biden is obligated to uphold the Constitution and disregard the debt ceiling statute to continue to pay congressionally authorized debt. Because this is important. The debt Biden and the Treasury are trying to pay, that we have to raise the debt ceiling to accommodate, was already approved. Congress already authorized that expenditure. It's not the president cutting checks or trying to usurp the power of the purse. He's trying to pay debt that Congress has already approved and ordered him to pay. Congress could, of course, choose to raise the debt ceiling cleanly and avoid the entire dilemma, but the GOP is refusing due to the same bad faith political brinkmanship they employed during the Obama-Clinton years. So, and I'll just omit this, but you can read it here, Biden should call their bluff, in my opinion. The president should order Treasury to continue to pay congressionally approved debt, dare the GOP to try to sue him. They lack standing, but could perhaps find a right-wing judge deranged enough to hear the case, and then dare the Supreme Court to take up the case. Because again, as we've discussed, when you try to file a lawsuit, you have to have standing. You have to prove that you have been hurt by a person's action. And if President Biden orders Treasury to pay debt to avoid a default, nobody would be hurt. Nobody would be hurt. So it's hard to imagine the GOP would have standing. But they might be able to shop around and find a right-wing federal judge that would grant them that, in which case the Supreme Court would probably, escalate to the Supreme Court. And then, as I say here, even though the Supreme Court is run by a regressively conservative supermajority, odds are they probably don't have the stones to try to order the president into economic catastrophe to satisfy the GOP's political caprices. So I think Biden's chances are solid. The idea being that as right-wing and as crazy as this current Supreme Court is, they have shown at least a few limits in the sense like they didn't take up President Trump's challenges to overturn the 2020 election, even though I'm sure they really wanted to, right? But they probably knew that that would trigger some sort of civil war or mass revolt. And so they went up to the very edge, but were like, we're not ready to do this. And so they disregarded it. This would be like the economic equivalent of that, right? So I think the chances are good that the Supreme Court would just choose to disregard, like to not hear the case. But you know what, as I said, even if they were deranged and partisan enough to take up the case and rule against President Biden, the president has one other ace up his sleeve, non-acquiescence, which is what I call Abraham Lincoln did when he ignored the Taney Court during the Civil War. So the fact of the matter is, Abraham Lincoln is universally, I think by most Americans, considered like the greatest president of all time, even surpassing President Washington and President Roosevelt. But the fact of the matter is, during the course of the Civil War, President Lincoln accrued a great deal of executive power in order to prosecute the war successfully against the Confederacy. And at the time, the Supreme Court was led by a conservative, Confederate sympathizing Supreme Court Justice, Roger Taney, I think is what his name was. And at least on a couple of instances, like one instance in particular, President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus and ordered the army to arrest, I'm pretty sure he was a sitting legislator, because they had credible reason to believe that this man, engaged in sabotage on behalf of the Confederacy against the Union. So President Lincoln ordered the army to arrest him and suspended the writ of habeas corpus to do it. And the Supreme Court, under this Confederate conservative sympathizing judge, ordered Lincoln to release him. And Lincoln said no. So the cool thing about being the most powerful man in the world in a time of crisis is that you can probably get away with ignoring a shitty court decision, which would further exacerbate that crisis, as Lincoln taught us when he lol-noped Taney after suspending the writ of habeas corpus. This is again suboptimal, is because the 14th Amendment has never been invoked before. Biden is an institutionalist at fault, and the market may react with uncertainty, at least initially. but it's better than a full-blown domestic and global economic calamity. And this is true. Like, presidents have never invoked the 14th Amendment before. And in a capitalist market, it's entirely possible that the market would react with volatility, like that they would demand higher interest rates on the Treasury continuing to like issue bonds and whatnot because we don't know what would happen. So there could be short-term economic consequences. I won't say catastrophe, but most economists agree, like the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, for example, that any sort of economic consequence or market volatility from Biden invoking the 14th Amendment would be nothing compared to actually a full-blown default, right? So you have to choose the lesser of two evils. And as I said, but long-term, it would be best for Dark Brandon to neutralize the debt ceiling as a point of leverage for a wildly bad faith Republican caucus, and it would probably stabilize markets long-term because we'd avoid the recurring threat of a GOP-induced default. Because again, we've run into this before. Republicans threatened it under President Clinton. Republicans threatened it 2 or 3 times under President Obama. And again, as we've discussed before, at least on one occasion, it got so close to the edge that the United States credit score was dropped for the first time in our history, and that racked up hundreds of billions of dollars in initial borrowing costs. That wasn't good for the market. And Republicans attempted it in 2021 under President Biden. So President Biden invoking the 14th Amendment and being successful would basically disarm Congress in that respect in terms of an economic default, and potentially even, the idea like the Democrats could potentially do it too one day. Maybe there would be a bad faith caucus of Democrats that would try to do what Republicans have done again and again and again. Well, a president invoking the 14th Amendment frees Republican and Democratic presidents in the future from being held hostage in this way with, hey, look, if you don't do what we say, we're going to cripple the nation's economy and hurt conservative voters, liberal voters, Democrats, Republicans, rich and poor. We're going to hurt everybody if you don't agree to our political demands. This is actually long-term best case scenario for everybody, that threat is neutered, right? And then I conclude by saying many constitutional scholars agree, which is true, so I'm for it. After Republicans, all hail Dark Brandon, he should beat them in their own game. That's what I believe. I just wanted to read that to you because, again, I was able to kind of just sketch it out very quickly in response to this person on Twitter, and I think it makes the case, and it's a reference point, I think, in terms of a written argument, in case you ever want to refer back to it, or maybe you could refer to this video. But anyway, yeah, that's where we are with the Republicans. We'll see what happens after the president's discussion with them later on today, but yeah, the GOP is threatening to publicly blow things up if President Biden doesn't allow himself to be extorted. It's disgusting.